Today we're sewing up another great pattern for you to add to your spring sewing list. This is the Poppy Blouse by Pattern Scout. This blouse doesn't have us bothering with any buttons or zippers. It just has ties to close the center front. It also features a beautiful collar ruffle that has the aesthetic of shirred fabric. But all we have to do is gather that fabric and top stitch. I loved the one that Casey's featured on the website, so I had to choose a sheer fabric as well. The fabric that I'm using in the video today is a sheer linen blend from Folio Fabrics called Jackson Pebble. Along with the sew along today, I'm hosting another giveaway for a $16 Pattern Scout digital gift card. If you'd like to enter the giveaway, stay tuned for the details at the end of the video. For now, let's sew a beautiful blouse. Place the front bodice pieces right sides together, and we're going to start pinning the center front seam, starting our pinning at the point transferred from the pattern piece, and then continuing to the bottom of the garment. Now we can start sewing at the point, backstitching to secure, continuing to the bottom of the garment with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Then we can open out that seam and press the seam allowance open from top to bottom, including the top unsewn portion. Once the seam allowance is pressed, we're going to tuck those raw edges underneath the seam to conceal the raw edges underneath. Doing this on both sides of the seam from top to bottom. Now that we've concealed those raw edges, we're going to edge stitch along the folded edge on both sides of the seam from top to bottom. Additionally, right at the bottom of the slit opening, we're going to sew a horizontal line from edge stitching line to edge stitching line, backstitching at both sides of that reinforcement stitch. Place your sleeve right sides together with the front bodice at the arm side, making sure to match your notches that indicate the front bodice, and pin in place. Do this on both sides for both sleeves. And then sew both seams with a 3/8 inch seam allowance and finish the raw edges. And then press both seam allowances toward the bodice. Then we can start attaching the back bodice. Here is the right side of one of my sleeves opposite the side that we just sewed to the front bodice. Place the back bodice and the open notched edge of the sleeve right sides together, matching those double notches, and pin in place. Sew with a 3/8 inch seam allowance, finish the raw edges, and press the seam toward the back bodice. And do the same to attach both sleeves. Place the front and back bodices right sides together as well as their sleeves, and pin together from the bottom of the sleeve straight across to the bottom of the bodice, matching the center seam. Do the same for both side seams and underarm seams. Then we can sew from the bottom of the sleeve straight down to the bottom of the bodice with a 3/8 inch seam allowance and finish the raw edges. Doing this for both side seam and underarm seams. And then press those side seams and underarm seams toward the back bodice. Fold the neckline binding in half wrong sides together and give that a press. Once that's pressed, open it back out, and we're going to fold both of the raw edges to that center crease. Give that a press from top to bottom, and then we're going to fold everything in half along that center crease and press once more. And follow the same steps to prepare both of your sleeve bindings. Fold your collar ruffle in half right sides together and pin both short ends. Sew both short ends with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Trim each of those edges by about half. Then we can turn the collar ruffle right side out poking out those corners. Now that our collar ruffle is wrong sides together, give that a good press. Now we're going to sew 3 rows of basting stitches along the collar ruffle, using the longest stitch on your machine, leaving thread tails at the beginning and the end of all 3 rows of stitching. Along the raw open edges, that row of basting stitches will be 1/4 of an inch away from the raw edge. The remaining 2 rows of basting stitches will be spaced 1/2 of an inch apart from each other. I've marked here with pins the outermost notches on my neckline binding. Now I'm going to pull the basting stitches that we just sewed into the collar ruffle so that the ruffle piece fits perfectly between those pins. Make sure that your gathers are distributed evenly, then we're going to place the collar ruffle and the binding right sides together, with the outer edge of that binding opened out flat, and pin right sides together from notch to notch. Then we'll sew the binding to the ruffle from one side of the ruffle to the other with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Now that that's attached, we're going to tighten the basting stitches at the top of the collar ruffle to tighten up that top row so that it's 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch shorter on both sides. Then for each row of basting stitches, I'm going to tie the loose ends in a knot to secure. Now we're going to be sewing 3 rows of top stitching between our basting stitches. I'm going to be using a stiletto to help me maintain the uniformity of the gathers as I sew. Now you can remove your original basting stitches, or if you like the aesthetic of the many rows of stitching, since our basting stitches have been knotted on the outside edges, you could just leave them in place. Now along the neckline and the tops of the sleeves from one center front all the way around to the other, we're going to sew basting stitches, stitching with about 1/4 inch seam allowance and once again leaving tails of thread at the beginning and end of your stitching. And pull those basting stitches so that the neckline becomes gathered. Now take the binding and the collar ruffle, and with the pressed edges of the binding still opened out, we're going to place the raw edge of the binding and the collar ruffle right sides together with the neckline. Start pinning at the notch that indicates the center front, doing that on both sides, and then match the notches along the binding with the shoulder seams of the bodice, and pin in place. And then continue pinning all around the neckline. Pin generously all the way around, and note that you will have more gathers at the top of each shoulder than along the rest of the neckline. Now we can sew the binding to the neckline from center front to center front with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Then we can trim that neckline and binding seam allowance by about 1/2. Now with the collar still oriented downward toward the bodice, take the opposite folded edge of your binding and turn it to the inside of the garment so that it covers the seam allowance and it's still folded along the center fold. Now that the binding conceals the seam allowance, pin in place. I'm going to be placing the pin right inside that binding seam so that the pin catches the inner fold of the binding as I go. Once the neckline binding is pinned in place, if you like, you can also continue to pin down the straps in the front to pin the two folded edges of the binding, as we're going to be edge stitching along the open end of the ties. Also, at the end of the ties, I'm going to open up that center fold and fold the raw edges to the inside by about 1/4 of an inch, then refold in half to conceal the raw edges of the tie and pin that in place. Doing that for both ties. Now, starting at the end of the tie, I'm going to sew along the open edges, stitching close to that edge, and when I get to the neckline, I'm going to sew as pinned, stitching in the ditch of that binding seam, periodically checking underneath to make sure that I am catching that inner fold as I go, continuing around the entire neckline, and then edge stitching back down the end of the opposite tie. Now you can turn that collar ruffle up and away from the bodice, and we're going to top stitch this loose center fold of the binding to the neckline from one center front all the way around to the opposite center front. To hem the bottom raw edge, we're going to be forming a narrow hem. Fold and press the bottom raw edge to the wrong side by 1/4 of an inch, and then fold that on top of itself by another 1/4 of an inch and press in place all the way around. Once you have the hem pressed all the way around, we're going to edge stitch close to that inner fold all the way around to complete the bottom hem. Temporarily open out the creases that we pressed into the sleeve binding, and place the short edges of the binding right sides together. Sew the short edges of the binding together with a 3/8 inch seam allowance and repeat for both sleeve bindings. Press those seam allowances open. Along the bottoms of both of our sleeves, we're going to sew basting stitches just as we did to prepare the neckline. I'm going to sew the basting stitches all the way around with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, starting and stopping at the sleeve seam, remembering to leave tails of thread so that you have threads to pull for gathering. Do this for the bottoms of both sleeves. And pull those basting threads to gather the bottoms of the sleeves. Now I'm going to start pinning the binding to the bottom of the sleeve right sides together, starting at the seams. Then I'll match up the notches and pin in place. And then continue pinning that single unfolded edge of the binding to the bottom of the sleeve all the way around. I've done this for the bottoms of both sleeves. Now I'm going to sew the binding to the bottom of the sleeve with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Then we can trim that sleeve and binding seam allowance down by about half. Now I'm going to turn the opposite folded edge of the binding to the inside of the garment, just covering this seam allowance just as we did for the neckline. I'm going to pin the loose edge of the binding on the inside, pinning through the outside right in line with the binding seam. Now that that's pinned, I'm going to stitch as pinned, stitching in the ditch of that binding seam, making sure to catch that inner fold of the binding as I go. Repeat all of these steps to complete the seam binding for the opposite sleeve. Give everything a final press and your blouse is complete. Thank you for watching this sew along. If you're interested in entering the giveaway for the $16 Pattern Scout digital gift card, all you have to do is leave a comment below and let me know what projects you're sewing up at the moment. The giveaway will be open from today, Friday, February 9th, 2024 at 10 a.m. Eastern, and it will end next Friday, February 16, 2024 at 10 a.m. Eastern. The winner will be announced in the description below, as well as in a Sew Happy community post. This giveaway is not sponsored by YouTube, and Sew Happy is solely responsible for choosing the winner and giving out the prize. I hope you enter, and I'll see you in the next video.